and then spread to my elbows, the backs of my knees and my ankles. The hands were the worst because they could not be hidden. The itch seemed to be only a millimeter below the surface, taunting me, demanding to be extinguished. And then when I tried to reach it, it retreated deeper and deeper. Frequently I would put my hands under a tap, turn the water on, and let it get hotter and hotter, until, as I rubbed the fingers together vigorously, the water scalded the itch away. As the pain of the itch became the pain of burning, there was a moment of intense relief, of delicious self-punishment. This moment was followed almost immediately by sensations of shame and despair, because, having done this, I would usually bring on septicemia. When I was 12, I read Shakespeare's sonnet about lust. The expense of spirit in a waste of shame is lust in action, and until action, lust is perjured, bloody, full of blame. But for me, the poem did not evoke images of carnal lust, about which I was always completely shameless, but about scrabbling in my own flesh, abandoned to this futile and costly moment of relief. My mother took me to an allergist. When we went back for the results, he shrugged and shook his head and said, "I'm sorry, but this boy is allergic to life." My mother didn't work. In the morning she drove us to school, and in the afternoon around 3 she picked us up. I remember her most clearly in the summer, leaning against the car smoking. She was a striking woman, not beautiful but attractive, with dark, melancholy eyes and a proud, almost defiant bearing. Her brown hair was held back by tortoiseshell combs, and in the summer she wore cotton dresses with large, bold designs. These dresses were always cinched tight below her impressive breasts. Her drinking, which in later life would shape and deform us all, was in these days only wild and sporadic. Around the time my younger brother Francis was born, our previously peaceful existence was shaken by a series of violent arguments between our parents. My sister Sarah and I would creep halfway down the stairs and listen as they shouted at each other. One night my mother yelled, "Why don't you go and jump in the river and drown?" Then we heard my father reply reasonably, but in deep depression, "Because I can swim, it wouldn't work." We suspected something catastrophic had happened, and it had, a betrayal which would mark their marriage forever. We felt something shift, but were too young to guess why, and would not learn what had happened for decades. I am in a bed and breakfast in Dayton, Tennessee. It's going out of business, and I am the last guest. The bed where I lie is huge and comfortable, but when I turn over it creaks loudly. I hear the hoot of an approaching train, and then the house starts to tremble. The train is so long that when the last car beats by and the engine hoots again, it's already a distant sound far off in the night. I try to go to sleep, but can't. My mind plunges inexplicably from one disturbing image to another, and I cannot stop it. I feel certain that my mother, Claire, from whom I inherited the Darwin gene, suffered similarly. Her superficial, often humorous pessimism was something we tried to laugh at, but we knew her gloom was profound and her imagination uncontrollably tortured. Eventually, she sought relief in alcohol and died of it. I choose to vent my imagination through writing, by grinding and reshaping life. It has enabled me to survive, both financially and psychologically, but it has also been a curse. In a letter to his wife, Darwin, who works 7 days a week, as I do, says, "How fortunate I am to have plenty of employment, for being employed alone makes me forget myself." Flaubert said the same thing in a different way. We don't write in order to live, we write in order not to live. I stay in my room, in my invented world, absorbed in play. On good days, I trick myself into a productive trance and vanish. It's addictive. And, as with all addictions, there are side effects. Every day you stimulate a kind of mental infection. The brain's septicemia is released, oozes up to the surface, and makes itself accessible to your nib. The transfer of this substance from brain to paper is the transmogrification of chaos into order, and so long as the brain is narrowly engaged in this activity, all is well. But when the day is over, it is sometimes impossible to stem the flow provoked in the morning. The infection continues to produce pus, but no nib is there to draw it off. Apprehension blossoms into anxiety. Perhaps this is why so many writers become alcoholics. I have read by the dim light beside the noisy bed, and I am exhausted and still cannot sleep. I lie in the darkness, trying to find my way out of an adrenal tube echoing with regret and fear. On nights like this, I try to calm myself by going back to a time in my life when I was happy and at peace. Often I find myself returned to the mill house in the village outside Cambridge, England, where I spent most of my childhood. I start by remembering my bedroom, an attic room on the second floor, where on quiet nights like this, I could hear the trains which ran between London and the north. They were further off than the ones in Dayton, but had the same quality of loneliness, yellow-lit boxes hurtling through blackness. I try to recall in detail my narrow bed under the low vaulted ceiling and the sound of the weir. I bring to mind the winters when we would skate on the mill pond, or the summers when we would swim in it. I bring to mind my father's small engineering company, which I watched grow each year from just my father and his partner, Peter, in the wooden shed alongside the house, until the enterprise filled every floor of the much larger mill. I remember the early days, when there were 10 workers or less, the men fishing at lunchtime, the practical jokes, the smell of oil, and the low, powerful grinding of a lathe. I remember the birth of my 2 brothers, first Francis when I was 5, and then Ludovic when I was 10. Francis was the most beautiful of children, with long, curly blonde hair and an amiable disposition. Ludovic, a more aggressive child, was born at home. Each day I would race down the lane to see if the baby had arrived. One day I rushed into my mother's room, and there he was, only minutes old. "Look at him," my mother said. "He has balls down to his knees." It must have been his scrotum, I suppose. But anyhow, the 2 of us laughed in amazement. But when I remember these early days, my other mother, my dark, intoxicated mother, intrudes, and a burst of something more powerful than sadness flowers in my torso. As I flip back through the pages of the internal album of my life, I find no shots of interrupted sex or furtive parental kisses, not a single recollection of euphoria. I try to remember her when she was young, the striking woman in the bold floral summer dress, hair gathered back by 2 large combs. I recall nights when, having scratched my flesh through to the bone, she sat with me and read. I remember her humor, which was savage and mordantly perceptive, or the rueful pride with which she'd tell the story of the allergist. "I'm sorry, but this boy is allergic to life." But these images are quickly swallowed by other memories of returning home from prep school to find the mother of the morning, the kind, oddly childlike mother, transformed into a bitingly cruel wreck, and the same feeling decades later, bringing back girlfriends and wives and finding the same tragic figure in the kitchen. There must, I tell myself, have been some happiness in this woman's life. After all, if nothing else, she gave birth to us and her 4 children. But nothing works, least of all this last assumption, because now my mind lurches as always back to the great mystery. How, if she loved us, could she be so melancholy? How could she be so miserable that nothing would induce her to seek help, if only for our sake? What incredible depths of sorrow could so contort a woman that she'd lay waste to all she loved with this ravaging despair? I want to believe that my mother's life was worth living, that the sum of happiness was greater than that of sorrow. I want to believe this, but cannot. I think she was fundamentally and profoundly